Hi, I'm Pike Malinovsky, the producer of the East Village Poetry Walk. Just want to let you know a few things before we get started. The walk is about 2 miles long and will take an hour and a half. It's meant to be one continuous walk, but if you go slow or stop somewhere, you can always press pause. You should be able to find your way from the cues in the audio. Please pay attention to where you're going though. Watch out for cars and bikes and other pedestrians. Kari Pitkin will be giving you directions. All the music that you'll hear is by East Villager John Zorn. Your guide for the tour is filmmaker Jim Jarmush.
Hi, I'm Jim Jarmush. I'm a big fan of poetry and a longtime resident of the Lower East Side. I studied poetry with Kenneth Koch at Columbia College. More about Kenneth later. And I've also had the great fortune of crossing paths with many of the amazing poets we'll be talking about today.
You should be in front of St. Mark's on the Bowery at the corner of 2nd Avenue and 10th Street. We'll be here for a couple of minutes.
For more than 60 years, there's been an intense poetry scene happening here in the East Village.
Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table.
Through the 1940s and 50s, American poetry was dominated by the high modernism of T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound. But in the late 50s and 60s, poetry changed dramatically, moving toward language that was looser, less formal, more open to politics and city life, sex and popular culture, more communal. Many of those changes first took root here, in New York City's East Village. These were the stomping grounds of Allen Ginsberg and the Beats.
Maybe the East Village was the only mirror that Allen ever needed.
Of Frank O'Hara and other New York school poets.
I think most of those poets have achieved something very important. They proved that humor and the comic impulse has its place in serious poetry. That wasn't taken for granted.
Of important Puerto Rican poets and the rise of the poetry slam scene.
The purpose of slam being to fill your hungry ears with nutritious sound meaning constructs, space shots into consciousness known hereafter as poems.
We begin our poetry tour at St. Mark's on the Bowery, a cultural institution that has been central to the East Village poetry scene.
If you want more history about the church itself, pause the tape and check out the panels on the iron fence along 2nd Avenue.
For many decades, St. Mark's has had a rich connection with poetry and the arts. Houdini performed here. Isadora Duncan and Martha Graham danced here. William Carlos Williams gave a reading here. In 1966, St. Mark's became the home of the Poetry Project, a bohemian literary organization that is a premier venue for many East Village poets. Anne Waldman, one of its first directors, remembers that St. Mark's in the 60s was a fertile place for more than poetry.
I was involved with the Young Lords, Puerto Rican nationalists group that met here. There was a Trotskyite group that met here. We had the Black Panthers had a soup kitchen, and Sam Shepard had his early plays performed here. And it's interesting that W.H. Auden was a member of the parish, of the church itself. And there's a wonderful letter, I hope still somewhere in the archive, that expresses his dismay at the new liturgy, which includes phrases like power to the people and down with the pigs and so on. He dropped out as a parishioner, but he continued to live on St. Mark's Place.
Now walk through the gate. Walk up the 3 steps and go through the other gate, the one to the right of that sign that says, "No dogs allowed." See that copper green statue on your right? Pause here for a moment.
Meet Peter Stuyvesant, governor of New Amsterdam in the mid-1600s. In his day, this area was a bowery, the Dutch word for farm. Right here on these grounds, Governor Stuyvesant put a little chapel, the foundations of St. Mark's Church. Now it's the second oldest building in Manhattan. Trinity Church downtown is the oldest. When Stuyvesant died in 1678, he was buried in the vault right here.
Now walk along the wall of the church towards the door.
They dream only of America, to be lost among the 13 million pillars of grass.
The words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living.
I'm through with you bourgeois boys. All you ever do is go back to ancestral comforts.
He holds a key in his right hand.
I'm a victim of telephone.
You should be at the door. Open it up and go on in. Go up those stairs to the right.
In 1968, Kenneth Koch gave a poetry reading here in the sanctuary. Kenneth Koch belonged to what became known as the New York School of Poets, a group of close friends who were inspired by French surrealism and by contemporary American painters.
Are you at the top of the stairs? You have a nice view of the graveyard from the window on your left.
Koch was a professor uptown at Columbia University, but his poetry had a following in the East Village. The night of his reading, something very strange happened here. One of his students, and one of my favorite poets, Ron Padgett, was there in the audience.
Let's hang out here at the window for a couple of minutes while we listen to the story.
I was sitting in the first pew, and Kenneth was introduced, I think, by Ann Waldman. And he began to read. I think it was his first poem.
This is just a little poem I wrote when I was thinking about this reading. It's called To My Audience. My audience of camel dung and fig Newtons, my audience of hats, and how shall I address my audience of New York green frock bats?
There was a pretty good crowd that night, as I recall. Kenneth was a very popular poet, and he had a big following in the Lower East Side area among all the young poets and art lovers around here.
Are you sure there is an audience? I won't go in if there's no audience.
After a brief period, suddenly behind him to his left, a door opened, and a young man came through the door, quite tall, about 6'3", wearing a kind of a ragged, beat-up Dostoevskian overcoat and with kind of a crazed look on his face. And as he approached Kenneth, he extended his right arm.
Morpheus sleeps. Mercury or Murphy.
And fired several shots at Kenneth.
That was a benefit shooting.
All I know is I got a big adrenaline rush, and it was followed by a huge rush of relief when I saw that Kenneth had not, in fact, been shot. And he immediately dug himself out verbally.
Well, now, I don't want the congregation to get upset by these hijinks. These young people have a very fine cause that they're working for, and
the, quote, shooter was actually an anarchist and radical poet named Alan Van Newkirk, while from the back, a colleague of his was handing out some kind of printed leaflets, radical publications under the imprint of Guerrilla.
Guerrilla.
I learned later that the colleague of the shooter in the back was a poet, a fairly recent Romanian immigrant named Andrei Codrescu. He had a Transylvanian accent, so it was compelling.
Well, I emigrated from Transylvania to Detroit. I didn't speak any English, and so when I got to Detroit, I fell in with a group of writers against the Vietnam War. And one of them was Alan Van Newkirk.
Van Newkirk was a little bit more elusive and fugitive kind of guy who had a kind of a reputation for being scary.
It was set up so that Alan would go up to Kenneth with a fake pistol and shout, "Death to bourgeois poetry," and then the two or three of us were going to throw newspapers in the air, and then the people would, of course, pick them up and read our manifestos and go ahead and commit world revolution. Except it didn't quite work out that way.
So why don't you stop interrupting the reading? Scram.
I was just sort of following the party line of Alan Van Newkirk, who sort of declared Kenneth a bourgeois poet at that time. But then, of course, when I read Kenneth's poems, I felt a lot more kinship to Kenneth's poetry than I did to that of Alan, So if there was a choice between shooting somebody, I think Alan would have been the more likely candidate for me.
Poetry used to live in its surrealist hand as a gun. Get out of here. Fuck you.
Get out.
Revolution.
Grow up. revolution.
And Kenneth went ahead and just picked up with the poem and read it absolutely marvelously, as if nothing